So, Mike, it's great to do this. Mike Giglio, for those of you who know, and I think everybody's familiar with his work, joined the Atlantic recently from other publications I forgot the names of already. It doesn't really matter. The past is the past. He is, as you all know, one of the great American experts on ISIS and the conflict there. I want to just make two quick observations before we jump in and talk. And we're going to talk a lot about what's going on in the world, but I also think it's really interesting for people to listen to Mike talk about his own background and how he came to be the person and the reporter that he is. The first observation is that this is an excellent book. I hope you buy it, even though it's we're selling it at full retail, I noticed. But it's good. It's good for the publishing industry. It's good for Mike. It's a great book. It's a couple of different books in one book. It is a story about a chaotic area at a chaotic time. It's also the story of a young reporter looking for trouble, a young reporter from Long Island looking for trouble, which is what I used to be before I got old and put on a suit. And we'll talk a little bit about that. It's also a remarkable achievement because somehow, in the build-up to a book, you're always looking for ways to generate pre-publication publicity. Somehow, and I want to find out how he did this, Mike convinced Donald Trump to unleash global chaos exactly like 4 days before the official pub date, which is hard to pull off. I mean, it's hard enough just to get on like CBS This Morning, but it's sort of hard to upend the entire Middle East. So we'll talk about that a little bit. But why don't we start? Because we'll get to the politics of the moment, which are intense and confusing, and you can be a good translator for them. But let's talk about reverse engineer this and start with the moment in your life that you decided you wanted to hang out with very dangerous people, very, very far away. How did you develop to the point where you're in Humvees with Kurdish guerrillas trying to fight ISIS?
Honestly, it was a book. So I was living in Houston as a reporter at the Alt Weekly there, and I was making a very, very low salary with no health insurance. And I found Dexter Filkins, your friend's book, on the war against the war in Iraq, and I read it, and I was like, it was like a really personal account of like what the war meant for the troops.
It's called The Forever War.
Yeah.
Many people have read it, probably.
And I just felt so guilty because I was fighting age. 9/11 happened when I was in high school. Actually, my buddy from high school is here. We were sitting in like third period. And we went to school in Mineola, so I think 20 miles from the Twin Towers. And they called all the kids whose parents worked in the towers to the office on the loudspeaker and sent us home. But then I sort of like just went on with my life. I'm not even paying attention to politics. And so I felt like this sort of sense, like reading the book and wanting to be a journalist, that like I've been so tuned out to all this, and I felt like it's partly my fault. Not like I need to serve in the military, but like I need to pay attention as a citizen. And the book moved me because it was just so personal and so up close to the war, and I was like, I got to do this myself. And so I sort of went on this crazy path to try to make that happen.
But you thought even back in Houston that you were going to aim for the Middle East?
I thought I was going to aim for whatever the American war was at the moment.
Right.
I didn't know if it'd be. Then we were still in Iraq. Then.
Right.
This is 2008.
Right. But you first detoured to Ukraine.
I detoured to Ukraine in the middle of the Middle East. So what ended up happening is I got sent overseas finally by Newsweek during the Arab Spring, and I was covering the war in Syria. And then you might remember people stopped caring about the war in Syria before ISIS made people care again, like it is now. And my job at that point became like, go get thrown into whatever crazy thing is happening at the moment. And so when the protests in Ukraine became a war in Ukraine, I was sitting on my couch watching Breaking Bad, and just, you get that feeling as a reporter where you're like, Ukraine protests, this definitely doesn't concern me. Everyone's obsessed with it. Like, I'm gonna totally just take a couple weeks to relax and
watch Breaking
Bad.
Right.
And I got a call from my editor being like, it's a war in Ukraine. Do you want to go? And it's just like,
sure.
Next plane.
Yeah.
And it was funny because I remember being on the plane with my friend who was a Turkish photographer. We always worked together, and like on the same plane from Istanbul to Crimea, which Russia had just unofficially invaded, was like every correspondent from the Middle East that I recognized from like Cairo and Syria. It was like, it's a war, like send in the clowns kind of thing. And so we all just arrived on the same plane, just kind of like, what language do they speak here, kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. We don't want people to know that foreign correspondents don't know very much about the places they land.
I mean, I will say, it's like if you're accustomed to like being like, I don't know anything, you actually can kick the crap out of a lot of the local reporters who are based there, who are like experts in like Russian lit and stuff, because you see things with fresh eyes.
Right, and because you're translating it for yourself, you're actually translating it for your readers.
And you're like, you don't have the. I mean, I actually think like my coverage got worse when the longer, in some ways, the longer I spent in the region. In that you start to.
Was that because you got too much in the weeds, or because you became inured to the novelty and craziness of it?
You get inured to the craziness. Like it was like it almost happened to me in Ukraine too. Like I remember, I was I immediately, like after Crimea, went to Donetsk, which was like, it was clear, like if there's going to be like a real civil war, this is going to be the place. And I sort of like ingratiated myself with the pro-Russia people who were becoming rebels and watched as they got radicalized by Moscow.
The ethnic Russian.
The ethnic Russians who were pro-Russians who were starting the rebellion. And on the one hand, I got told by Ukrainians later that I was one of the Western correspondents who covered it like a local would have, because I had those fresh eyes on it. But on the other, like to your point, I remember there was a crackdown where people got shot and killed in the street, but it was like 2, and I went home. I went to my hotel, and my editor, Miriam Elder, who's a Russia expert, was like, "What are you doing? What happened?" I'm like, "Oh, just a couple people died." And so no story. And she was like, "No, this is not. See, this is Europe. This is a big deal." But I was missing it because I think there's a problem with you kind of get numb to the news at some point.
Right. That is interesting. It's an interesting aside about being a foreign correspondent and acknowledging that the different regions have to produce different levels of death in order to maintain the interest or gain the interest of American and European readers.
And it's not like I'm not sympathetic to the death, but it's like after Syria, I mean, it was just, where the government's barrel bombing and carpet bombing neighborhoods and civilians are dying by hundreds a day. You just kind of think, well, if the world doesn't care about that, they're certainly not going to care about a couple here.
Right. Talk about Ukraine in the following sense, because one of the things I'm always interested in reading books like this is how often the writer comes into close contact with death, possibly his own or her own death, and how blasé you are about it. But Ukraine is the first time that you actually found yourself in real trouble. Tell that story.
So it's like, I think the most dangerous parts of covering a conflict are when everything changes in a day, when all the red lines move and like what was safe the day before becomes not safe the next day. So it happened that, like I said, I was with the rebels and, going to their meetings and having way too much cognac with them, for weeks. But then, like, there was a day where the fighting got really bad, and there were, like, Ukrainian airstrikes, and it was in this town called Slovyansk, which was like a 3-hour drive from Donetsk. And, it's like you're familiar with this kind of reporter moment. Like, you get the call from New York, and it's like 5 or 6 a.m. your time. Like, you need to get to this place now, and you don't really think. So I got my driver, my translator, and I headed out. But because the fighting had gotten so ugly, and because the Russian language media, like that was directed by Moscow, had crazily ramped up their propaganda. They were telling, through the media, they were saying that Americans were killing Ukrainians. And then the people at the checkpoints believed it.
Did you know that when you woke up that morning?
I was like, just trying to get there.
So you drove into a trap.
I drove into a checkpoint,
media trap in a kind of way.
Exactly. And I have a whole list of rebel commanders that like when you go through Iraq, like you might carry like a picture of you and like a militia commander in case you get through their you need to get through their checkpoint at some point.
My trick was always, by the way, I told everybody in the Middle East that I was related to Bill Goldberg, the professional wrestler, which is completely plausible because we have the same last name. But that was about it. Huge with Hezbollah, weirdly. No, huge. Yeah.
But so, I have my tricks that I do, but it's like in a situation like that, like sometimes it all goes out the window. And so, that's why in Egypt, same thing happened to me. Like one day the government says America is your enemy, and all of a sudden the police who were so friendly the day before would not dare to touch an American journalist or kicking the shit out of you.
Right.
But so here it was like I got to like the third checkpoint, and the people at the checkpoint were just like, "You're an American, get out of the car." Your Americans are killing Ukrainians, and you want to be like, "You're drunk on propaganda, sir." But you just kind of have to be like, "I'm so sorry about that. I'm not part of the government." But
Which they don't believe in.
Yeah, they were threatening to kill me there, and instead, and I mean, it was a mess. This doesn't often come out in this. I mean, one reason to write the book is like to show that what I think you can show better what a conflict looks like in a book than you can in a news article. So I wrote about like getting abducted, which ultimately happened here. But like I didn't write that like my driver had a panic attack, like a heart attack almost, and the rebels had to send him to a hospital while they were then kidnapping me to go another way.
Right.
But it's like,
did you have the idea at the moment to try to have a panic attack?
I did have later.
Because you might get into the hospital.
I recount in the book my own
Yeah.
panic attack.
Yeah.
I'm not super hardcore about this kind of stuff. I like feel the fear. I don't know. Some journalists get the adrenaline. I was always waiting for it to kick in, and it never did. But so they put me on a bus. They duct tape my head. They had a blindfold, like a really a painful blindfold, and they were doing the same to any other journalist that came through the checkpoint. So it ended up being like I think 10 of us. Like CBS got kidnapped too, and they brought us to like a shed. And we did like the put your hands against the wall. And actually, the Washington Post wrote about this incident that I recounted because it was so curiously weird. And it shows you the rebels at the end of the day are just like amateurs, like anybody in a war. Ends up, a lot of times in civil war, it's just amateurs going bananas. But the guy next to me was a British cameraman, and the rebels were questioning him, and they said like, "Where are you from?" And he was like, I'm British. And they said, "Pronounce the word garden." And he said it, and then they started beating him, and they were like, "You're American, like you're lying." And then I'm like, "Well, I'm American," So then I started like, having like the, I thought they were going to shoot me in the head. But they did the same test for me, and I said garden, and I said I'm American, and they were like, "You've passed," and then like just moved on, like just completely. And then they asked me if I needed a chair. Like, this guy's clearly having a hard time here.
Oh, really? They saw it in you.
Yeah, and I write in the book, like, it was a moment, like, it's like you feel like you're flickering between, like, war and peace. They were like, should we kill him or should we give him, like, a drink of water? Like, both impulses were there at the same time.
Right. That expression you use, amateurs going bananas, is actually, I mean, it's sort of a sub-theme of this book. And I want you to stay on this when we're talking about ISIS now and talking about that war. Yeah. One of the interesting things here is how many people on the margins of the conflict you sort of got to know fairly well, like literally in the border region, but also people who were toggling back and forth between aiding ISIS and not wanting to aid ISIS. But talk about this amateurs going bananas thing, because we think of this conflict in global civilizational terms. We think of it in terms of grand geopolitics, Russia and Turkey and the United States, in Iran, in zero-sum competition. But talk about your impressions of getting into the zone and realizing that no one really knows what they're doing. Yeah. Some are doing the things that they're doing malevolently. Some are trying to make the situation better. But talk about that chaos, because something that happens in newspaper writing frequently is that people are imposing coherence on a situation that is fundamentally, organically incoherent.
Yep, and it tends to, unintentionally, that glamorizes war, right? Like if you're putting war into a frame of this is a logical thing between logical actors, you're actually getting it wrong. It's chaos, and mostly uncontrolled chaos. Especially the way it plays. I mean, maybe World War I with battlefields and trenches and stuff might have felt different, but I'm sure actually, and to the soldiers, it didn't feel much different. But one thing I think can be problematic in like war reporting is I like sort of like the typical like men's magazine way of writing about it, where you're like, I am a man of who's going to war, which is a manly enterprise among men, and like kind of this like hero way of writing about it.
Little mini Hemingways.
Yeah, and like. I really like I mentioned, like I'm just basically terrified the whole time, and I try to like really actually tell it that way, because I think like if you don't see war as just like the worst possible thing happening to just regular people who are just suffering, then you're not really getting it. And even to the soldiers, like so much of it is just you're here because you have to be. You'd rather be anywhere else, and like you're just kind of like suffering through it. And so when I say like war is like civilians and regular people going bananas, like I'm not trying to trivialize it. I'm trying to say like it's like just normal people put into circumstances that they're not equipped for and can't control, and they get swept up into the madness. And actually, like, I made a real effort to get to know ISIS members and enablers, like, as they were living and working. I met defectors too, but I really wanted to try to meet people like while they're in the moment doing it, and I found that was the case for them, like oftentimes. That they had taken a series of steps that somehow put them in this moment, and if you see it that way, it humanizes them, but it also makes the whole thing actually scarier, because you're seeing the humanity and the normalcy of someone doing these completely abnormal things.
Right, right. I have to ask the question: if you're terrified the whole time, as you say, why did you go to the world's worst place? At the time, it was the world's worst place. Not that it's anything much better right now.
I mean, on the one hand, like, I hate being there, but on the other hand, like, I miss that actually in DC, like the sense of mission that if I'm not there, then it's not going to get told. And I thought that it was just important to be there, and to be there, like, on the edge of it. Like, I mean, as well as anyone, like, the fog of war happens, like, it comes immediately after something happens. So, the reason I'm in Mosul in, like, the attacking convoy, for example, is because if I'm not there really seeing it as it happens, like, I'm not going to get a clear picture of what it is. And like, for me, that meant, like, what are the, like, you can interview a soldier about a battle. It's going to sound a lot more heroic than if you see it fought. If you can write about civilian casualties and the interplay between U.S. airstrikes and civilians and where they are and how it's operating, but if you're seeing it in action, like, you're going to get a much clearer picture, and I really felt compelled to try to do that.
Right, right. Talk a little bit about, before we move to the sort of the politics of the moment, talk a little bit about the things that left you most moved or most terrified. Talk about, let's start with what's the worst thing you saw in the ISIS conflict? It doesn't have to be a specific day.
I can tell
but
you.
what is something terrible that manifested itself in this war that made it unusual, even by the standards of the Middle East?
Actually, like, people's stories. I mean, maybe this probably because I'm a journalist, but like, people's personal stories actually affect me more than, like, seeing dead bodies. Like, I don't like to see dead bodies, right? But like. One thing I think about, at least once a week, is like a man I met from Mosul. I was investigating civilian casualties from U.S. airstrikes, and he, so I went into neighborhoods that had recently been liberated, like, without a military escort, and I found, by talking to interviewing locals, like, where there had been civilian casualties from U.S. airstrikes, and you show up at the rubbled house, and then inevitably, like, a neighbor will come in and ask what you're doing, and then you can find, like, a relative or something. And so I met a man who had his entire family, like 4 daughters and his wife, who he was, like, so in love with. He went to go get, like, gas for their generator, and the minute he left, the house got destroyed by a U.S. airstrike. Like, they must have had bad intelligence or something, and it killed all of his daughters. But his neighbor told me that he would come back like a couple times a week and pick through the rubble and then, like, break down crying. And when I interviewed him, he told me that because he still hadn't found all the pieces of his daughters, and he was like, on this, like, endless search to find them so he could bury them, so he could, like, finally, like, leave the city. And so, like, stories like that, I think, like, what actually happens in a war, like, how does it actually affect people, really stick with me, and it makes me think so hard about, the language, even, like, in America, where people play with the idea of civil war, and I think people just don't get what it actually means.
Yeah. Let's rewind to before the last week or two. Was the United States, before the latest eruption, was the United States in a position where it could legitimately say, you know what, because of our involvement in this conflict, ISIS has been nearly defeated and eradicated?
Could we have said that?
Could we? I mean, people said that, obviously, including the president. I'm talking about before the recent eruptions. Do you think that ISIS was on the way out?
ISIS is, as I think most people here know, is Al-Qaeda in Iraq regenerated. So the same people that the Americans were fighting during the war you covered, and that that I read about when I was in Houston, managed to go underground after the U.S. surge and withdrawal.
Well,
and
after
then
the army was,
reconstitute.
after the Iraqi army was destroyed, essentially. Yeah.
So you covered the surge and you covered the defeat of Al-Qaeda, right? But they went underground. They're an insurgency by nature. And they're very comfortable as an insurgency. And so that's what the situation
Are they more
is.
comfortable as an insurgency than as occupiers of discrete territory?
I mean, I write this in the book, like I always had the impression, especially after the US got involved in the war, that like, I think the way I described it is like, the caliphate was too crazy to last and ISIS seemed to like it that way. Like I think, ultimately they knew they weren't gonna hold this territory. I think they just wanted to make the fight for it as extreme and as brutal and as bloody as possible so that they could then have a better chance of surviving as an insurgency. And so when ISIS, and also, I mean, you might have had a similar experience, like over the years talking to US military officials, I sometimes felt something like relief from them that ISIS had declared that it had a state because, it's like, the way I heard it said, like, if they plant the flag, we can take it away. Like,
Right.
the U.S. military knows how to defeat a state. It's
No,
never
I
been able to
remember
defeat a citizen.
way back in the day, Donald Rumsfeld being frustrated that, and I'm phrasing this in a somewhat sarcastic or snarky way, but it's actually also true. The complaint was there weren't enough targets in Afghanistan to bomb.
Yeah.
It's not. It's a pre-industrial
right.
society. So how do you actually attack the Taliban?
So, and this is a big problem, I think, and I wrote a piece about this last week, and I've written about it before. The U.S. troop presence in Syria and in Iraq, to a large extent, it's secret special operations forces, and we don't talk about them. The government doesn't have to acknowledge that they're there. And so Americans don't know what they're doing. What they're doing is rolling up insurgent networks that ISIS maintains across Syria and Iraq. And I think, under Obama and Trump, it's easier just not to talk about this stuff because neither of them really want to be associated with a serious U.S. troop presence.
Right.
But I remember when, in December, when Trump first announced that he wanted to withdraw from Syria, I was having a conversation, I was making dinner, and my neighbors were over, and I have a very well-informed neighbor who works in politics, and she was like, yeah, of course, pull them out. What are they even doing there? And I'm like, oh, so much, actually, because ISIS really is a threat, but no one knows that. And then trying to actually report on the record what they're doing and how they're working and what the extent of the problem is extremely difficult. And I think we're just very misinformed as a country.
Right. All right. So take us to. Well, I mean, there's a theme here in this conversation of chaos. I mean, you're describing ISIS, and people sometimes, ordinary, I use the word in quotes, but ordinary people don't understand that some people just love chaos. We have our own version in politics right now of chaos love. In the sense of constantly shifting policies as it relates to this particular region, and not only this, but talk about the impact of the decisions that Donald Trump has been making over the past 2 weeks on the fight. And again, I know that we're both allergic to the idea of imposing coherence on something that's moving.
Yeah.
But can you impose a kind of analytical coherence on this moment?
This is a perfect build on what we were just discussing. So U.S. forces we're still in Syria trying to combat ISIS insurgent networks in Syria, and they're also in Iraq. So ISIS, I mean, the New York Times report, I don't want to rely on someone else's reporting, but they had a report this summer citing U.S. government officials saying there were still 18,000 ISIS fighters across Iraq and Syria just underground. So, the U.S. presence in Syria in particular is designed to target these networks, and they're working with local Kurdish counterterrorism units to do that. For the United States, just like that, to end that operation, it means that these networks get to survive. Not only that, but Trump injected chaos into the one part of Syria that was relatively stable because the U.S. troops and their allies were there and rebuilding. And now all of a sudden you have Turkey, which is a completely untrustworthy actor when it comes to counterterrorism. Invading, sending their own jihadi proxies into the region.
Just pause on that for a second. Why is Turkey an untrustworthy ally when it comes to combating terrorism? Because of their definition of some groups as terrorists when they're not?
I mean, not that they're not, but like Turkey's priorities have been, over the years, like Assad at one point, not anymore, the Kurdish separatists in southern Turkey who were connected to the Kurds in Syria, and then like internal Turkish political strife. where they like, and then their focus on ISIS comes like after that. And so, you know, the book recounts the years I spent on the Turkey-Syria border, you know, documenting like the trafficking networks that send ISIS fighters into Syria, out of Syria to Europe, oil smugglers who, you know, are funding ISIS, and artifact smugglers, and it's just those networks were never, you know, cracked down on really effectively by Turkey, and they never really made a serious effort. And you know, it's a little bit in the weeds, but it just because I think it's so important to understand Turkey. Like they are, you know, throughout all this war against ISIS, they've had their own internal political battle going on, and because of that, Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, has massively shuffled the security forces. So he'll like take all the police and intelligence from one province and just like move them to another because he doesn't know like where his enemies are. So he's trying to disorient them, and it works. But if you were really trying to stop ISIS on the border, would you just like take all your cops and spies and move them and throw it into chaos? And so Turkey now being part of like the, you know, the one part of Syria where there was some order is really alarming.
Right. What are the, and we're going to go to questions in a minute, but what are the consequences of this set of decisions over the past couple of weeks? I'm not asking you to predict the future necessarily, but what are the trends?
I mean, for me, it's that ISIS survives, possibly gets stronger. ISIS fighters, not that this isn't happening already, but to a larger degree, escape to the West, or go to the West.
The president even said that they should go back to Europe.
He like very nonchalantly, oh, they'll just go to Europe. Meanwhile, Trump came to office by fear-mongering about ISIS going to Europe and America. But now it's just dismissing it as like, sure, that'll happen, big deal. And then, you know, ultimately the Syrian government's going to retake control of the country, and then we're talking about another completely unreliable counterterrorism partner, country, not partner.
Right. What are the consequences for the possibility of international ISIS terrorism, as opposed to, you know, in Syria or along the Turkish border or in that immediate zone?
Look, I mean, covering ISIS when Trump and the rest of the populist politicians in Europe were like fear-mongering about the refugee crisis and saying that ISIS is taking advantage of it, like, which they were, I always had the feeling like we shouldn't, we're putting too much emphasis on terrorist attacks and we're overhyping it as, and so I don't want to do that. But, and like, you know, now that Trump is saying it's not a problem though, I think we should just like, yes, it is still a problem, and it's definitely going to make it worse. You know, in Europe, I mean, they're countering ISIS plots like, you know, on a pretty regular basis.
Right. We know that the Pentagon, the intelligence community, State Department, obviously, the experts in these agencies all believe to one degree or another that this is a disaster. Do you, based on your own reporting, do you feel as if there is a pivot coming in which the president and his top advisors might listen to that kind of analysis? Or do you think that we're doubling down now on a kind of isolationist stance when it comes to this terrorist issue? I
mean, I hate to try to predict what the administration might do next. You know, you're seeing now Trump say like we're going to guard the oil fields, and he said the Kurds should go to the oil areas, which are Arab areas. I just spoke. We'll have a story tomorrow with the political leader of the SDF, and I asked her like she's in.
Explain what that is.
She's the political leader of the Kurdish-led militia that the U.S. was working with in Syria. She's in D.C. now, like begging for like last-ditch. I don't want to say she's begging, but she's in a very bad position, trying to get the Americans to give them some semblance of support as they enter like political negotiations with the Assad regime, which is now the ramification of all this. And I asked her if she knows what that meant, and she's like, I have no idea what that means. You know, are you suggesting that all the Kurds leave and like in some version of like ethnic cleansing? Like you know, it's a confused policy continuing to emanate because I think Trump's advisors, like you said, are trying to tell him that this is a bad idea, and maybe they like convinced him that oil is the reason to stay, like to try to like get him to mollify some of the bad effects of this decision. But I think.
But what you're saying is
really
ordering the Kurds to go to the Arab areas is a recipe for another conflagration, obviously.
Yeah, it's not going to happen. It just shows that he's not thinking through what these decisions mean in any way. And that to me, I read that really though as like my own just analysis of the news. I read that as his advisors doing damage control, but like the damage control is not going to ultimately, I think, have much of an effect. So I don't think there's going to be this kind of shift back to a more sensible policy. I do worry if there is a resurgence of ISIS or there is an attack somewhere and the US government decides, yeah, now we need to get involved again, how? Because the whole strategy that the Obama administration put together was we're not going to send troops, right? We're going to work with local partners. And the book really documents who are the local partners in Iraq and Syria. If you're leaving them to be destroyed or co-opted and you're betraying them, who will work with you next time? And I don't see an answer to that.
How is this different from other previous mistakes made by other administrations in the Middle East?
It's not.
I mean, what are the characteristics that make this unusual?
So, I was speaking with someone about this the other day who was involved in the Obama withdrawal from Iraq. And it did, in some way, help set the stage, with many other factors, for the resurgence of al-Qaeda in Iraq as ISIS. Because there had been an argument at the time that U.S. troops should remain longer to help make sure that al-Qaeda networks were really decimated and make sure local forces could deal with them. But the difference is, as this person pointed out, that was at least very well thought out. Like they debated all this. Maybe it was a mistake, but they planned it. It was a plan. This was not planned. It happened in an instant, and I think that those who are arguing that this is part of some Trump strategy are really doing a disservice to the debate we're having and to our understanding of this.
To the word strategy.
Yeah, and like, not just that, but if you want to pull U.S. troops from Syria, I think right now, probably a bad idea based on what I've laid out about the ISIS, threat that remains there. But you could have planned it. But I read in the New York Times that as U.S. troops were retreating from areas, Turkish-backed forces were firing on them. So this is not a planned withdrawal. Another story that we'll have tomorrow. Sorry to keep flagging my Atlantic stories, but
no, I don't object.
Yeah, but a story that's going to publish tomorrow morning is that all the aid workers who are working for U.S. and international NGOs are now trying to get out. And I've talked to NGOs officials here in D.C. who are trying to find some way to help their staff manage, where to go and how to get out. And there was no planning for this. So they're just sort of left in this situation where all of a sudden their staff is at risk and there's been no preparation whatsoever. So, I mean, it is really just total chaos.
Right. Why don't we take some questions? We have a mic. There's one right up here.
The question is more of a general sense. You've mentioned several of the conflicts you've been in, that you'd seen patterns in how people were behaving. And it was enlightening for me to hear that these are just normal people in a horrible situation. I don't think that gets come across much. So from like a social science or a human element perspective, is there a common, are there common elements that then can come up to help prevent war or to address it when it happens, to get people thinking a little differently? I know you're not a social scientist, but is that conversation happening at all? Are those connections being made with people who have experience, with people who may be able to say, look, if we approach it this way, this may not turn into a horrible situation?
I think that's a good question. I'll just give like a limited answer based on something the U.S. government tried. So one aspect of this that the U.S. government at one point understood was, the way that our government functions is very slowly in disaster situations like this. And they want to, what would be effective would be to get to a place immediately and try to administer aid and support and stabilization as soon as possible, because the longer something festers, the harder it is to then control. And they actually had a bureau at the State Department that was designed to do this, and they tested it out in Syria, and they had diplomats that went out in rapid response and were canvassing on the opposition, because they were really action oriented. You can imagine the bureaucracy eventually crushed it. And now they still exist, but they don't do that kind of work anymore. So I mean that's one answer, but I haven't seen any real effort beyond that to kind of try to think of a new way to deal with the conflict.
You get over here, and then we'll go there. Straight down here.
In your experience there, do you see any impact to the Christian minorities in the area? Do they go the way of the Kurds?
The Christians are, the biggest threat to Christians is extremists. And so any ISIS resurgence is obviously bad for Christians like it is for any minority. The Syrian regime, which is going to retake control, I think, in Kurdish areas, generally protects Christians. So I don't know that this is necessarily going to result in some big new problem for Christians in Syria. I do think generally, like, the continued presence of ISIS is definitely a problem, though, for the Christian community in Iraq and Syria.
Could you update us on the Yazidis and the other ethnic minorities, and what specifically? I mean, go a little bit deeper on what the decision making here means for ethnic and religious minorities generally.
So the Yazidis are a religious minority based in northern Iraq that ISIS attacked after they took a bunch of territory in Iraq, and they committed a genocide against them, and they took a bunch, like thousands of Yazidi women and children as slaves. And the book, actually, there's a character in the book who was an ISIS like field commander during the massacre and recounts seeing it. He later became, because of that, he defected. But it tells the story like through his eyes as he saw his colleagues executing people on the streets. They're still vulnerable. That territory is right on the border with Syria, so a problem in Syria.
I mean, in other words, any opportunity ISIS has to grow will have a negative impact on Yazidis almost axiomatically, right?
ISIS as an underground movement targets anyone it perceives as an enemy. So the Yazidis are there. I mean, it's been assassinating local village leaders in Iraq for a year and a half now. And so I just want to mention one thing about the Yazidis, though. So we have this problem of thousands of ISIS prisoners held in Syria, and now the fate of these prisoners being up in the air. Like, if they go to the regime, will they get executed, or will they escape somehow? And in any case, will they ever be brought to justice? I mean, the Yazidi, if you want to move on in some way as a society from atrocities and injustice like this, there need to be trials and convictions. So the Yazidis, I don't think will get any sense of closure from, unless there's some kind of movement to address prisoners and the abuses that happen. And obviously there's no way to do that if these prisoners are just marooned in Syria or in Syrian government hands.
Right. Yeah, over here. Very good. And then we'll go over there. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. One of the questions in my work in northeast Syria, I have come across people, especially who have actually switched sides from IS to al-Nusra or any other group, and basically their reasoning was that they were opposed to Assad, and they felt aggrieved by what Assad did to them, and so literally the decision making was based on which group had the maximum amount of weapons which month, because the weapon flows often differ. So it was not that they were necessarily ideologically attached to a specific group. One thing they were committed to is anti-Assad.
Yeah.
So right now, with the current situation and the Russians and the Assad, obviously there will be a large handover. How do you think it's going to affect the population that's already there, irrespective of whether Assad does anything bad or not? Do you think that hostility is going to come back if it goes under the...
There's a quote from an ISIS defector in the book that says, when I asked him why he joined ISIS, he said, "I didn't like ISIS, but I thought ISIS is a state, and only a state can fight a state, so I thought they had the best chance to defeat Assad." And I had an argument with my editor in writing the book when I started, because the book starts with the Arab Spring, and then it moves to civil war in Syria. And the editor said, start with ISIS. But I don't think you can understand ISIS if you don't understand what happened with the Arab Spring, but also especially what happened in Syria, and how much the suffering and the lack of international action against Assad, as the Syrians see it, inspired and enabled ISIS to rise up. So I mean, when you're talking about rebels who, and this person I had mentioned that was an ISIS member, obviously he was a defector by the time I spoke to him, and he left because he thought that ISIS was not actually fighting Assad. And so Nusra, Jabhat al-Nusra, or whatever it's called now, which is the al-Qaeda franchise in Syria, they have always kept this narrative that they are really fighting Assad. And so it's not surprising to hear you say that ISIS members would leave and join them eventually. I don't know what it means for groups like that if Assad comes back. I mean, on the one hand, once the Assad government retakes control, I mean, with Russian and Iranian help, I think the rebellion will end. And so for I think maybe pockets will remain unstable, but I would expect that those groups ultimately will have to either give up their arms or run to Turkey or be decimated.
Well, can I ask you adding on to that, a hardcore realpolitik question, which is, if what seemed to be inevitable even before this latest round happens, and Russia, some combine of Russia, Syria, Iran, and Turkey impose collective control on the entire region, that can't be good for ISIS, right? And what's not good for ISIS is good for the United States. So, I mean, is there some kind of weird play here? I'm not suggesting that there's forethought on the part of the president about sort of multiple bank shots, but if you, I'm really trying. But could you imagine a situation in which it's not a moral solution, but it's a solution in which these Sunni terrorists are suppressed in a kind of collective way? Or do you think Turkey will simply keep them going in order to have another pawn in the game?
I want to think that this is a good outcome, or like a best case outcome, that the regime reestablishing control means that ISIS will be further decimated in some way. I think, ultimately the area that the Kurds controlled, with the United States there, was going to have to return to regime control.
Right.
And if you talk to U.S. officials before December, when Trump first made this announcement, they were hoping to have a political negotiating process in the long term that would allow them to reintegrate these areas from a position of strength and maintain the autonomy structures that they were building and the government structures that they were building, and also have had time in the interim 3 years or so that it might have taken to further erode ISIS's networks. If the regime just kind of like snap returns on its terms, I'm not sure what that looks like. Like if they decide to play nicely, which they have not done, that would be great. But what they've done instead in areas where they've returned to control is target regime critics, put activists in prison, resume torture and stuff. And so that kind of instability, I think, isn't great for keeping a terrorist organization down. And then you also, I mean, it's better than chaos. But you also have to remember the Syrian regime's own history in deploying jihadis for its purposes. Like,
right.
You remember from the Iraq War, they took jihadis and sent them to Iraq to fight the Americans.
Right. I mean, it's better than chaos in one sense, but the violence gets done, but it's invisible to the outside world. I mean, it's not chaos versus peace. It's externalized chaos versus a regime imposing its horrible practices on a captive population.
Yeah. But I do. I mean, just to be clear, I do think actually the best case scenario now is that the regime just takes control and brings some semblance of order. That's better than chaos. We just have to keep in mind, like Turkey, Russia, and Syria have not been honest brokers in the counter-ISIS fight. Turkey says terrorists, they mean Kurds. Russia, when it first started bombing in Syria in 2015, said it was bombing ISIS. It was bombing the CIA's rebel allies that were fighting ISIS. Not because they were fighting ISIS, but because they were America's people. And then the Syrian government has its own history that I just mentioned. So.
Right. I have time for 2 more questions. There was a gentleman over here and then a woman over here. Right, raise your hand just for a second. Thanks.
Isn't that saying this is a $7 or $8 trillion mistake, that they were better off at the beginning with Hussein and Assad in power? And why should we trust people now that, they had Bush and Cheney and PNAC and Scooter Libby and Cheney and Douglas Feith? It's like, isn't that saying that the whole thing was first Iraq and then Syria and then Iran, and now they're walking it back, and it's just $7 or $8 trillion waste and all the countless suffering?
I know Syrian activists who were part of the pro-democracy protests in the Arab Spring who were saying as far back as late 2013 that they wish they had never started it because of how ugly it got. So I think any sensible person, as bad as the Assad regime was, would say we were better off without this happening. Any Syrian at least.
But I think the question is also about American involvement going back all the way to the post 9/11
To
period.
get us into war.
Right.
It's like,
Yeah.
Who are you supposed to trust now? The people that voted for the war, or
But it's an interesting question because, and let me just be devil's advocate for a minute. Does Donald Trump, fine, we understand that Donald Trump doesn't know necessarily the fine points of the differences between Kurds and Arabs or however you want to slice it, but he has this instinct that's not an unpopular instinct among many Americans, which is, what the hell are we doing in the Middle East?
Right.
I mean, it's a terrible place. Everybody seems to kill each other. Nobody can explain it to us. I mean, when you draw, these Rube Goldberg contraptions of how the place works. Is there some kind of, I'm asking for your own personal opinion, is there some kind of underlying intelligence there which says, you know what, we can walk away from all these crazy people without downstream consequences for us?
I hope that's true, because that's what's happening. I think the point always to make with right now is no one sensible was saying U.S. troops should stay in Syria for the long term.
Right.
It was just to try to find a political accommodation and to do the work of eroding ISIS networks to the point that it wasn't likely to become a threat again, and that just hasn't happened. And so my fear is that we have to, in some way, America has to get involved again some point in the future.
Right. I think there was one more question down here. Yeah, right, if you can give that on. Thank you.
So what I was wondering, you mentioned at the beginning, sometimes it seems that the thresholds for the amount of people who are killed is dependent on the country you're reporting in. And sometimes it seems as a news consumer that you can tell by the way news stories are laid out on a newspaper how much people care about violence in a certain region versus another.
Yeah.
And it seems like sometimes, you see a picture of an individual family and it brings attention, and then all of a sudden the news moves on to something else. How, as a reporter, do you fight that, and how do you get people to continue to care? Do you think it's just bringing individual stories, as you mentioned, or is there something that you can do as a reporter to make sure that it's constantly in people's mind and that they don't sort of normalize violence in the Middle East? And it reminds me of that famous quote of the death of one person is tragic and the death of a million is statistic. Yeah. How do you combat that?
My strategy in covering the Middle East especially and the war in Syria and in Iraq is because I understand that people tune out eventually, is to always find a way in whatever story I'm telling to emphasize why America is involved in this, like what its involvement has been and why in some way or another it bears responsibility to try to make readers have that same sort of connection that I had when I read that book back when I lived in Houston, that just I might want to tune this out, but actually this reflects on me. I mean, ultimately, if we live in a democracy, Americans are responsible for the country's foreign policy. And so for me, it's always kind of making sure we're trying to find a hook to get people to understand that, the U.S. has played some role in what's happening here as well.
It's a great question. I love the fact that somebody under 50 cares about newspaper layout also, by the way. That's awesome. Yeah, thank you. That's great. But I mean, it is a fascinating question, and neither of us speaks on behalf of the mainstream media or the non-mainstream media. So I don't want to assert something that other people might not believe. But there's a tremendous amount of more work we can do to make people understand the lives of people far away who are dying violently for unjust reasons. And we could always do more compelling reporting and more compelling writing. But fortunately and unfortunately, in the media environment today, we know exactly how many people are reading stories and how long they're staying on those stories. And we know what people are interested in and what they're not interested in. And what American consumers are not interested in is stories from, among other places, Syria. And back in the Obama period, the cynical but true observation was made that the U.S. would never have gotten involved in Syria at all if ISIS had not kidnapped and ultimately executed 4 American hostages. That's what brought it in. There was no pressure on the part of the American people to go solve a human rights catastrophe. So, yes, there's always more that the mainstream media can do, but what the priorities you see are also the priorities that are a direct reflection of the American news consumer, and so that it's tragic, but that's unfortunately the reality. What I would say is that writers like Mike and books like this are our best chance to convince people that places like this matter. And you'll see in this book, when you read it, if you haven't read it already, that he does a remarkable job of humanizing people in faraway places who are ostensibly not like us at all, but he does do a great job of humanizing people who do not get much thought in the world today. And so I want to compliment you on this great book.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you all for coming, and enjoy yourselves outside. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.